Greetings. My name is Andrew Isaacs. I'm on the faculty of the University of California, Berkeley Haas School of Business, where my job is to teach climate science and climate change strategies to our business students. In this video, we'll talk about carbon dioxide removal, nature-based and engineered solutions, and carbon offsets. We'll also explore what does and doesn't work when it comes to addressing climate change. Let's begin by looking at Earth from space. At the horizon, beneath the black of space, you'll notice a light blue band. That's our atmosphere. Our atmosphere is a pretty thin layer of diffuse gas, mostly nitrogen, oxygen, and argon, with a few trace gases, some of which are greenhouse gases that warm the planet, such as CO2. As you know, every day we're adding additional greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, in particular, more and more CO2. Now, carbon dioxide essentially has an infinite half-life. It does not break down in our atmosphere. So as we add more CO2 to our atmosphere, with basically nowhere to go, the concentration of CO2 just keeps increasing, warming the planet to higher and higher temperatures. Fortunately, there are natural geological processes that will permanently remove CO2 from the atmosphere. But unfortunately, they are very, very, very slow. In the past few decades, we have come to realize that in our atmosphere, carbon is forever. When we take carbon out of the ground in the form of fossil fuels and put that carbon into the atmosphere as CO2, it will stay there forever. Once we stop, within a few decades, the planet will settle at a new, higher temperature. And Earth will stay at that new, higher temperature for hundreds to thousands of years. As all of us who study this have pointed out, the heating effect of carbon dioxide probably persists for 10,000 years or more, absent unproven technologies for scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Which leads us to the need for carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. Scenarios of future climate change increasingly assume the use of technologies that can remove greenhouse gases, in particular CO2, from the atmosphere. In such negative emissions scenarios, it is assumed that at some point in the future, widespread efforts will be undertaken that utilize such technologies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and lower its atmospheric concentration, thereby starting to reverse CO2-driven warming on longer timescales. So, what does that negative emissions technology look like? Well, for carbon dioxide removal to make sense, you need three resources more or less in the same location. The first of those is a source of CO2. The more concentrated, the better. We can take CO2 directly out of the air, what's called direct air capture. But air is not a very concentrated source of CO2 at only about 420 parts per million. A better source of CO2 might be a coal or natural gas-fired power plant, like the one shown here. Those flue gases have a CO2 concentration of 10% or greater, making them a more useful source of CO2. But of course, we can't count on coal-fired power plants being around indefinitely if we plan on doing something about climate change. The second resource that you need is a source of zero-carbon electricity. That's pretty easy, using either wind farms or solar farms. And in any event, that's the cheapest kind of electricity available anywhere in the world today. We need that clean electricity in order to power whatever carbon dioxide removal technology we plan to use. The third ingredient is a well-characterized geologic reservoir to hold the CO2 we've captured and liquefied. Well, there's a lot of these reservoirs in thousands of places around the world. They're called oil fields. And by definition, an oil or gas field is a geological formation with lots of porosity and some kind of caprock that keeps fluids underground more or less indefinitely. So, if we capture CO2 and compress it into a liquid, it can be pumped underground in many places in the world, including depleted oil fields. Now, what I've been describing in general terms is what we refer to as an engineered solution for carbon dioxide removal. These engineered solutions are just what they sound like, a method for taking CO2 either from the air directly or from a concentrated source like a power plant, compressing the CO2 into a liquid and then pumping it underground, all using clean energy. There are a few of these pioneering engineered solutions operating today, and many more in the planning stages. Engineered solutions have clear pros and cons. The advantages are that engineered solutions absolutely work to store CO2 below ground, most likely permanently. There's a big disadvantage to engineered solutions, though, and that's that they're very expensive. These days, to capture and store 1 ton of CO2 below ground runs from $500 to $1,500 per ton. An alternative that's far less expensive is what we refer to as a nature-based solution. Nature-based solutions usually involve forests in some way, either preserving a forest from being cut down or possibly restoring the forest in an area. Nature-based solutions have pros and cons that are exactly the opposite of engineered solutions. Nature-based solutions are very inexpensive, perhaps $5 to $10 per ton of CO2 captured. But, and this is a huge problem, it is dubious as to whether nature-based solutions actually work. So, there you have the basic landscape of carbon dioxide removal options. Engineered solutions that are expensive and definitely do work, or nature-based solutions that are inexpensive and might or might not actually store CO2 taken from the atmosphere. But whether it's an engineered solution or a nature-based solution, they still cost money. So who pays for the carbon dioxide removal? And the answer so far is that most of the money is coming from what we call carbon offsets. A carbon offset is a financial mechanism that seeks to compensate for greenhouse gas emissions in one place by funding emissions reductions or carbon removal somewhere else. There are thousands of companies worldwide that are happy to take your money for one of these offset projects. Any number of individuals and companies these days are purchasing carbon offsets in an attempt, ostensibly, to reduce their climate footprint. We'll take a quick look at one example of how this works. There's a debit card company in the UK called Tread. If you use one of Tread's debit cards, you have the option to, as they put it, cancel out your climate impact by offsetting your carbon footprint to help save the planet. For example, when you make a purchase of groceries or pay an electric bill or purchase an airplane trip, a small amount of money will go to a project that claims to be taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in some way. What are those projects? Well, the 4 plans that Tread offers are pretty typical for carbon offsetting projects. One project involves reforestation in the Amazon. One involves funding net negative buildings, which basically means buildings made from wood. Another project involves funding renewable energy projects like wind farms. And the 4th pays for preventing deforestation. All of these projects sound worthwhile, and they are worthwhile. As to whether or not they do anything for the climate, well, that's much less clear. And as to whether or not these projects actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere permanently, that's highly questionable. Voluntary carbon offsets are credits that you purchase to offset your actual emissions. In other words, you keep emitting greenhouse gases as you would have, except that now you're paying for someone else to, in effect, capture some of your emissions from the air and store them for a while, typically in a forest. Or pay someone else to avoid emissions, say by preventing deforestation or avoiding the use of fossil fuels. The problem is the same with both approaches, and that problem is provability. First of all, you have to prove that the reforestation project actually happened or that your wind farm actually got built. Proving that isn't too difficult, but proving the other aspects of the project is extremely difficult. For example, you have to prove that the project really worked as intended. That means that if you hadn't paid for it to happen, would the project have happened anyway? And if the answer is yes, then your involvement was not needed, and you are claiming a climate benefit for something that you are not involved in. We call that problem a lack of additionality. What if instead you were paying for a forest to not be cut down? Let's say that your deforestation prevention project was successful, but that instead a different forest got cut down since yours is now being protected. That's called leakage. And again, you're accomplishing nothing with the credits you purchased. Now, finally, it's almost impossible to prove how many tons of CO2 were actually captured by any of these projects. Maybe a lot, or maybe none at all. But the biggest flaw with many offsetting projects is the inability to prove that the effects were permanent. After all, if you paid for a forest to be planted, and the forest really did get planted, and the forest really did capture many tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, as you had hoped, if the forest is cut down 100 years from now, then you have accomplished nothing. Verifying that permanence, unless you can master time travel, is impossible. The problems I just described have been understood for years. Nearly 20 years ago, it was pointed out that there is no policing of the voluntary carbon market. There still isn't very good policing. And as a result, claims of climate neutrality by the companies, individuals, and organizations that purchase these offsets are probably misplaced. The world cannot offset its way to carbon neutrality. All emissions will need to be eliminated eventually. Critics of carbon offsets add a few more arguments too. First, offsets simply allow the wealthy who burn the most fossil fuel to pay their way out of their climate problem without altering their practices. In other words, voluntary carbon offsets are mainly a mechanism that allows you to look like you are virtuous by claiming that you've canceled out your emissions, even though, as we've just seen, those offsets may not in fact be doing anything at all in terms of addressing the climate problem. And secondly, if purchasing offsets is cheaper than reducing emissions, and for nature-based solutions it typically is, businesses won't have an incentive to develop greener practices. So, if you or your company really wants to have a climate impact, you should focus on reducing your emissions first.